Hmm. Welcome to New 302 on April the 8th, 2021. Hmm. And here we are. This is effectively the final lecture. Um, it has been uh, an interesting tour. I mean, in a most unusual year. Certainly the most unusual year of my life. I've had some unusual years, but this one, in terms of its global properties, is very unusual, which I think maybe I'm not the only one who's finding that. Yeah, it's interesting. I've never had to do this particular thing that I'm doing right now, um, which is to say that I don't typically have a lecture or a topic per se prepared for the final class. Um, it's interesting. It's interesting, an interesting process for me to sort of forethink about this rather than just engage the space. And that I think maybe is one of the more kind of defining features of the year. Of course, it's not done. We have office hours tomorrow, and I really sincerely that people. Let's try it again. We have office hours tomorrow. I really sincerely hope that people will drop in to socialize next Thursday. So whatever that is, the 15th, next Thursday. Hopefully, with things sort of out of the way and space kind of cleared, we can get together and have a few drinks and chat and just generally hang out via Zoom. Um, and defer a real world meeting until such time as the real world thaws. And of course, there's other aspects too. There's still marking to be had, and I'm still planning to put up the bonus mark game and a few things. But this is sort of the last installment of this. And as always, of course, there is a peculiar paradoxical quality to the time that's passed, because at once it's taken a long time, and yet here it is. That was it. That was 2 semesters. Um, it's interesting. It's interesting. It's always interesting. Um, there is a big difference, obviously, this year, insofar as we're all doing this somewhat virtually, and there is something for sure to be said for classroom culture, obviously, and in a course like this, it's really important. It's a really important thing. But actually, what I was reflecting on is how struck I was at actually the sense of human encounter that I have had. That there has been a kind of regular set of encounters, and there is always this feeling after the year is done. It's a smallish group typically, right? It's under 30, and there is this sense of what people have encountered, who they are, how they've changed, their challenges. Those things tend to come out very clearly, and perhaps more so even this year. And there's a sense of the encounters that people are making with each other, and it's really clear when I talk to people by writing. It's clear in people's presentations. It's very clear when I look at the conversations in the post board, and of course, it's clear in the office hours and discussions. Right? Many conversations that have been had across a really wide swath of topics, and you get a sense of the invariability heuristic of people, right? So the more ways in which you engage and the more dimensions that you engage, the clearer and clearer becomes your sense of the invariance, right? The notice invariance, and that invariance has something really fundamental to do with who they are and how they affect other people, and it's a fascinating experience for me. So, like I said, I've not had to do this in pre-recorded form before. Um, I suppose I probably should have in the spring, but I didn't. It wasn't a lecture per se, but the standard has clearly been set differently here. Lectures are this sort of primary way that I'm communicating. So to try to roll things up, does this class have a point? Does this class have a point? Let's find a point. Um, Obviously, this class is about the ideas of I mean, that should be pretty clear, and post Jungians and depth psychology. But that raises this really interesting question, I think, about what depth psychology is about. Class is about depth psychology, but what's depth psychology about? What was Jung on about? What is any of this? And obviously, there are lots of different ways people can come at this. There are lots of different points of contact and points of interest. Um, and not just for individuals, within individuals. If you're buying into the psychodynamic hypothesis, there are lots of different ways you connect to it. Well, lots of ways I connect with it. There are ways in which I think of it as being a very sort of complex, abstract, intellectual game in a way, right? A fun game that you can play where you sort of, are categorizing things, viewing things in certain ways, right? Play the game to see if you can pick up the hidden patterns and so on and so forth. So there's that. But more than that, depth psychology, as I said at the outset, is striking to me in part because unlike sort of most modern systems, it's a kind of whole life psychology. It's a whole life system. It's designed to address the entirety of being in some sense, in a way that not many things do, right? Religions do and cultural frameworks do. But it's a particular kind of thing. It's a particular kind of way of doing this and of trying to understand what's going on with us and trying to understand the perils and progressions of our lives. And to me, it occupies this striking position in that field. I learn from it all the time. I learn from it every year. Every time I re-encounter the material, every time I re-encounter other people working with the material, I'm pulling this sort of inexhaustible sense of richness from the way that it applies in. And that's not to say that it doesn't go into dialogue with things. As I've pointed out, I don't think that it's a perfected and completed system either. But what it does is it reaches. It tries to include, it tries to be complete, often at the cost of being consistent, as per Gödelian incompleteness. But nevertheless, it really reaches to include everything. It reaches to include things that sometimes we don't even want to look at. And it reaches to include things that are deeply mysterious. And it reaches to include things that are deeply strange. I said to a client not that long ago, we were talking about, sort of the emotional resistance he was having to certain tasks, and I was setting him up with some dialogue. So one was an inner child dialogue, and another was a dialogue with a figure that he had a lot of heroic sympathy with, Kobe Bryant, and has experienced a lot of grief since Kobe's death and is still grappling with that and trying to figure out why. And so grappling with this inner child piece with him, there's a piece of him that got, traumatically snapped off and left behind. And another piece that he developed, this sort of shining heroic persona that compensates for that, so he'll never be weak again, but also keeps that piece, at bay and separated and isolated and so on and so forth. And so he's been working to try to get in touch. And always, because he's localized in this heroic persona, he wants to know what to do. When we talk about the dreams, textbook, incredible dreams, we talk about the dreams and we talk about the experiences in his life, and then he always comes around to what to do. And likewise, I suggested, the Kobe thing, and he said, talk to them in dialogue, talk to the child, talk to Kobe. And he was resistant. He was like, you talk about magnetic fields. I can feel those magnetic fields pushing off. And I said, yes, because they're force fields. And they're erected because one part of you thinks whatever is inside is dangerous, but it's not dangerous. It's treasure. It's a gift, right? What's inside. But there is a huge emotional field, this huge emotional magnetic field that repels him. And what's he afraid of at the end of the day? He's afraid of associating with this piece of himself. He's afraid of what's going to come out. He's afraid of the emotions. He's afraid of the feelings. And he's scared. It scares him off. But he notices these, anomalies. He notices these strange hitches and inconsistencies and oddnesses in his behavior. And so I said to him, look, if I was going to boil this whole thing down to one line, I could simply, I think, boil it down to pay attention to the weird. And that means that, pay attention to the oddities in your own experience. That doesn't mean obsess on the bizarre, but it means pay attention to the weird. There are things in all of our psyches that are strange, inconsistent, slippery, hard to keep your mind on, but pay attention to them. Pay attention to the things that seem odd. Pay attention to the things that seem alien. Pay attention to the things that seem autonomous. Pay attention, right? open lines of communication. Open yourself up. Open yourself up to the idea that maybe those things are not your enemy. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily get to stomp around and do whatever they want. That's not true necessarily, right? But there is a dialogue that has to open, and of course on all sides, we're afraid. There are parts of us that misconstrue it. They think it's death, and after you go through a few ego deaths, you stop being so uptight about the whole thing. But even still, you're going to get resistance from these pieces that don't really understand what's going to happen, and they're afraid to die. But they don't. The pieces go into conversation, and then we change, right? So pay attention to the weird, I guess, is what I would say the takeaway is. Pay attention to the weird and try to wrap your arms around the whole thing. It's hard, but you can examine aspects of it, especially the difficult ones, and especially the things that you hitherto have set aside or discarded, right? There is a kind of humility that's necessary, I think, to make that sort of approach. And yet there's a kind of egotism that's necessary to even attempt it, right? You have to, in some sense, take on a belief in your own powers and strength, and yet somehow balance that out with this deep humility in the sense that you are going to sort of unbecome, right? You're going to become something bigger. You're going to outgrow your wound, right? And it's hard and it's painful. But it's also wonderful and useful and filled with mirth, and filled with such a multitude of experiences of your own being and experiences of the world, that it is immeasurably enriching to do so. And so it's not just about, escaping your pain and working out your weirdness, right? It is those things where you strangeness, getting your madness into a coping state, right? Being able to get along with other people and being able to move your life ahead. But it's also about calming that counsel within you and finally realizing what you can do together, getting a very mixed group of people finally on side with each other, mixed group of beings on side with each other, and perhaps addressing some kind of common agenda of growth and moving forward and making a difference in your own life and other people's lives. And that is worth a lot, I think. So I obviously have enormous respect for lots of other fields. I teach other things. There's a reason. And I teach because I like to teach. I like to encounter people. And I like to share information. It's all very interesting to me, right? Interesting to share, interesting to receive, interesting to have those encounters with people, and people all walking their own path. I'm fascinated by all of it. And so that's, I would say, if we were looking for a point, that's it. This isn't, it's an academic course. We're learning about specific sorts of things. We're applying specific skills, but it's more than that. And you don't even have to be particularly orthodox about it, right? You don't have to be like hardcore and agree with every, categorical statement or whatever. The point is that there's a spirit to the thing. And the spirit to the thing is this spirit of exploration, and the spirit of forgiveness within oneself, and the spirit of acceptance, and this experience of inclusion, and the spirit of coming to a formulation of what it means to be an individual moving through time, moving through the stages of time, touching other people, and experiencing human being in a deep and direct sense, right? That's the spirit of it. And whatever else you're bringing to bear, that willingness to encounter your own totality and to encounter the mystery, I think, that is a very deep mystery of being and the world, and to recognize like just how deep all of that goes. That's the point. Yeah, hard to round that out. That's the point.